Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Wallsend history story. This week I am covering a little bit of information about the Hall grounds in Wallsend. Now this won't really be a history story of the Hall grounds, it's more or less just my description of the area as it was, as it is now, but it will also include a couple of little news articles from over the years. I hope you will enjoy it and find it interesting. Now I am sure that most of you will already know that the Hall grounds was originally part of the garden belonging to Wallsend Hall. The name itself is obviously a kind of giveaway, the Hall grounds. I have to admit that it must have been amazing to live in the Hall when the grounds were part of your garden. Imagine being a child with all of that land to play in. But sadly, many of those who lived in the Hall, such as Robert, Richards and Dees, didn't actually have any children. But it must have still been nice to just say, I'm away for a walk in the garden, and you could have been gone for an hour, just walking from one end to the other. The land was later given to the council for public use when Sir J.B. Hunter bought the hall and grounds for the people of Wallsend, and by 1922 it was already being landscaped for public use, with a view to link it to the already established Richards and Dees Park. The Hall grounds includes a lovely stream with a couple of little bridges that cross it, along with what is always described as a weir at the end near to the bottom of Crow Bank. Until the recent revamp it had looked very different to how it did originally, but the revamp put it back to how it was in the past, and I have to admit to find it quite hard to remember how it used to look when I was a kid. One thing I do remember though is that the bridge was missing for years, so it's definitely nice to see that back again. And I thought it might be fun to add this photo into the video of the bridge in question. The two photos that you can see at the moment were taken about 25 years apart, with the newer one taken in around 2017. It does show how the new bridge was built to look almost exactly like the original. Sadly, I can't say the same about myself, as I definitely no longer look like I did in the older photo, or the more recent one. There were various footpaths in the Hall grounds, some which led down from the back of the hall, and others that led from what I would call the side of the hall. The whole area was, and still is, filled with various different kinds of trees and other wildflowers and plants, making you feel like you're out in the countryside. There is also the area which used to house the vinery wall and greenhouse. I assume at some time in the past this would have been well used, and can you imagine being able to make your own wine for the posh parties that were no doubt held at the hall? Still talking about this little part of the hall grounds, I remember as a kid often wondering where that little gate in the wall had led to, often imagining that there was a little house behind it. And I know that many Wallsenders had different ideas of what it was and what it was used for, some calling it a grotto, others even saying it was a lion's den. It was, of course, a lot less exciting, but it was fun to let your imagination run riot. The wall sadly collapsed in places several years ago after the grounds had just been recently modernised. But it wasn't all bad, as this gave us the chance to view the inside of the vinery walls and the little ovens, as I call them, what would have been used to heat the greenhouses. The wall is sadly still not repaired yet, and offhand I'm not sure how much the estimated repairs were going to be, but I do remember it being a rather eye-watering figure, due to it being so old and needing to be put back to how it would have originally looked with handmade bricks, etc. I also always kind of thought it would have been nice to preserve it in the way that it is at the moment, that allowed people to see inside the walls and still be able to see the ovens used for the heat, because I think that would have given you a much better idea of what the walls actually were used for. But who knows, maybe one day the money will be raised and it will get repaired. Also, in front of that wall when I was a kid, you would have found several tall trees. A lot of people thought these had been part of the original plans, but they weren't. And it is very possible that these trees were responsible in part for the collapse of the wall, with their roots getting under the brickwork and making it a lot less stable. And although the exact date that they were cut down is not known, they were gone long before the grounds were revamped in around 2014, I think it was. And I know a lot of people miss, gosh, I nearly said something very strange there. I know a lot of people miss seeing them, as you could see them from quite a distance away. I am sure many of you will also remember that the hall grounds used to contain a little part of the Roman wall. Now, I was always convinced when I was younger that this was where it had actually been found, but of course this was not the case. And as I soon found out, this little bit of wall had moved around quite a lot. From old photos and postcards, it would seem that it was first placed in the park beside the lake, as it can be seen on one old postcard just along from the little humpback bridge. However, at the time of the postcard, the humpback bridge was a much larger and very different bridge. And later it seems that the piece of wall appeared higher up in the hall grounds near the fence that backs onto Queen's Terrace, before finally being placed in the hall grounds on the opposite side to Queen's Terrace, near to the stream, sort of sticking out of the bank. This final location is probably the one that most of us will remember, though I have to admit that I did find it rather difficult to explain where its last location was. It was originally found in the grounds of Swan Hunters in around 1903, when work was ongoing to extend the yard and to build the shed that would be used to build the Mauretania. And there used to be a plaque in the grounds of Swan Hunters that mentioned it, but I must admit that I'm not sure if that is still there today, so perhaps someone watching this will be able to tell me if it is still there now. And when it was originally discovered, I can only assume that it was decided to move it away from the shipyard and place it somewhere where it could be seen. And this, of course, was in the early 1900s and at a time before Segadunum Museum existed, so there wasn't really anywhere close by where it could be displayed. And I don't know who it was who decided to put it into the park, but it was probably a good idea, as a lot of people did get to see it and learn a little bit about the Roman history of Wallsend. I don't really know when it was moved from the park to the hall grounds. It's all such a long time ago, there's probably not any great detail about it, but it seems that it was something that they did want to keep for people to see. And eventually it was removed from the hall grounds and taken back to Segadunum Museum. Although to see it now, it does not look very much like the wall I remember from the hall grounds. So I was wondering just how many of you watching this do remember that bit of wall and maybe climbing up on it and jumping off the end. I know that I remember doing that, so do let me know if you do too in the comments below. There was also a well in the hall grounds, but sadly, and I have looked, I have never been able to find any evidence of the well, but I believe it was somewhere close to the old vinery wall in the area just behind it. Old wells were quite common in Wallsend, but it's almost impossible to really locate any of them now, as the area has changed so much. I have yet to find any evidence to support my next comment, but I would assume that at one time when the land was the private garden for the hall, that it would have been all fenced off, because I'm quite sure that you wouldn't want random strangers wandering around your garden. Of course, I can't forget to mention the stream in a little more detail. If you're lucky, when you're walking in there these days, you might see a few fish. And of course, there's always lots of ducks and moorhens and often little baby birds to see as well. A few years ago, we even had an otter for a few weeks. But to be fair, the otter in question was not a local one. It was unwell and had to be caught so that it could be treated for the, I believe it was, fishing wire that was round its middle. After its recovery, it was released in a more wild location, but it did cause quite a bit of a stir for the time that it was in the hall grounds. And I can also remember part of the stream that is still there today, where you used to be able to walk over from one side to the other on the kind of tiny little weir, I suppose you would call it. And if you are brave, unlike me, you can probably still do that today, but I wouldn't actually advise it because I wouldn't want to fall in that stream. Finally, I just want to add a couple of little articles that I found relating to the hall grounds from the old newspapers. In 1953, two unnamed 10-year-old boys were fined for climbing two chestnut trees in the Hall grounds. I can only assume these were horse chestnut trees and that the boys were looking for conkers. Both of the boys were fined £1 each, and at the time it was said that this kind of thing must be stopped. It was thought that these two boys may not have been the first and would not be the last, but any more caught climbing the trees would be fined the same as these two boys had been, as they really didn't want anyone climbing the trees. I can't help but wonder what they would have thought of the kids in my day, throwing big sticks into the trees to get the conkers down, breaking the branches, and no doubt climbing up them whenever they could, and of course making rope swings off any low enough branches that you could reach. Luckily though, it never seemed to do the trees any harm, and most of the trees, and especially the conker trees, are still there today. Another little story from 1954 was about the replacement of the gates at the King's Road entrance. When told that the price may go up from the estimated £350, Councillor Mason asked if these were the golden gates. It seems he was not alone in finding the cost rather high, and it was even suggested that they should be replaced with wooden gates. The argument went back and forth for a while, and I have to admit to including this story simply because of Councillor Black's comment. When discussing the gates, he said that he quite liked the idea of them being golden gates, as he thought it was the only way that Councillor Mason and some of the other members would ever be able to get close to any golden gates. He did conclude though by saying that he did not want to see the appearance of the Hall grounds being spoilt by placing something inferior in the place of the metal gates. I never actually found any further details after this, but I don't think that the wooden gates idea was ever put into practice. I do hope that you have enjoyed this little wander around the Hall grounds from the comfort of your armchair. It was much less history and much more just a little chat about what's there. And if you haven't been there for a while and you do still live locally, then it really is a nice place to visit, with, as said, lots of wildlife to see. I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.